My name is Kevin Hart. I am 71 years old, and I need to tell you something that took me 43 days to understand. I have spent 35 years studying how people behave when they believe they are not being observed, what they say, what they reach for, what they reveal about themselves in the moments when they believe the consequences have been removed. I did not expect my own son to give me a case study. This is that story. The reading of the will was scheduled for a BLOS. Tuesday afternoon in March, at the offices of my attorney, Carol Vance, on the third floor of a building on State Street in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I arrived 15 minutes early. I sat on a wooden bench in the corridor outside Carol's office. The bench was uncomfortable in the way that benches in corridors are designed to be uncomfortable, functional rather than welcoming, a place to wait rather than to rest. Through the frosted glass of the office door, I could hear voices. My son Jay and my daughter Lisa had been shown in before I arrived. Carol had asked me to wait outside until the reading began. I had agreed because I had reasons for agreeing that I did not explain to Carol and that Carol, who is a thoughtful attorney, had not asked for. I heard Jay's voice clearly through the frosted glass. He was speaking with the ease of someone who has arrived at a moment he has been anticipating for a long time. He said, "Dad is finally gone. We can stop pretending everything was fine." Lisa said something I could not make out. Jay said, "Lisa, he's gone. Whatever he left us is what we have. Let's just deal with it." I sat on the bench with my hands folded in my lap. I had been sitting in uncomfortable chairs and on hard benches and in fluorescent-lit waiting rooms for 43 days. This bench was not significantly different from any of them. What was different was what I was waiting for. Carol opened the door 2 minutes later. She looked at me. She looked at the door she had just come through. She raised an eyebrow. I said, "I heard enough. Shall we begin?" She held the door open. I walked into the room. Jay was seated at the conference table with his back to the door. He heard Carol enter and started to speak without turning around. He said, "Miss Vance, before we start, I want to raise some questions about the timeline of the estate." Then he turned. The expression on his face in the moment he saw me is one I have spent 35 years teaching students to recognize and describe accurately. It was not surprise exactly. It was the specific recalibration of a person whose model of reality has encountered a fact that does not fit the model and who requires a moment to decide which to revise. I said, "Hello, Jay." He said nothing. Lisa said, "Dad." She stood up. She came around the table and put her arms around me and held on for a moment in the way she had held on since she was 7 years old and the world had done something unexpected. I said, "It's all right. Sit down. Let's begin." This is the story of what happens when a son forgets that his father spent 35 years studying exactly this. My name is Kevin Hart. I am 71 years old. I was born in Reading, Pennsylvania, the son of a high school guidance counselor who believed that understanding why people behaved the way they behaved was more useful than judging them for it, and who spent 30 years in a school system trying to pass this belief to adolescents with mixed but not discouraging results. I studied psychology at Penn State, spent 3 years in a clinical practice working with adolescents in the same kind of school system my father had served, and realized at 28 that the questions I was most interested in were not clinical but forensic. Not why does this person struggle, but what is this person hiding and how can you tell? I completed a doctorate in forensic psychology at Temple University in 1982 and joined the faculty of Harrisburg University the following year, where I spent the next 35 years teaching courses in behavioral analysis, deception detection, and forensic interviewing. I published 4 books. I consulted for the Pennsylvania State Police, the FBI field office in Philadelphia, and on several occasions for attorneys who needed expert testimony on the credibility of witnesses and the behavioral indicators of deception. What I taught, in its essential form, was this: people are not good liars. They believe they are. The confidence with which a person believes in the completeness of their deception is itself one of the most reliable indicators that the deception is incomplete. A trained observer who knows where to look and who is patient enough to wait for the revealing moment will find what they are looking for in nearly every case. The revealing moment almost always comes when the person believes the observer has stopped observing, when the door is closed, when the stakes appear to have dissolved, when the performance is no longer required. I had been waiting for my son's revealing moment for 20 years. I had not expected to find it on a bench outside an attorney's office in March. But I have learned, in 35 years of this work, that you do not choose the moment. The moment chooses you. You simply have to be paying attention when it arrives. I retired 3 years ago at 68, selling my consulting practice to 2 former students who had been ready to run it for years. I moved into the house in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania, where my wife Margaret and I had lived for 27 years. Margaret passed 18 months ago, a stroke, sudden and complete. She was 67 years old and we had been married for 43 years, and her absence from the house on Chestnut Street is the thing I am still in the process of learning to live with. I have 2 children. My daughter Lisa is 40 years old. She lives in Philadelphia with her husband and their 2 young daughters, and she has her mother's warmth and my directness and a quality of practical honesty that I have always found both admirable and occasionally challenging to be on the receiving end of. She called me every Sunday without fail. She visited every 6 weeks. She was at the hospital within 4 hours of the call. My son Jay is 44 years old. He lives in Pittsburgh, where he works in financial management and where he has lived for 15 years with the particular self-containment of someone who has decided that distance from his family of origin is a healthy boundary, rather than an avoidance. He called on holidays and birthdays with the reliability of someone meeting an obligation and visited approximately twice a year in ways that felt like events rather than simply being together. The relationship between Jay and me has never been uncomplicated. He is, in some ways, the child who got the version of me that was most absorbed in the work. The years when I was building a career and teaching and consulting and traveling for court appearances and arriving home to a family that had learned to manage without my consistent presence, Margaret had managed it. She had been, in ways I had understood intellectually but not always practically, both parents during the years when I was most useful to everyone except the people who needed me most. Jay had grown up knowing what his father did for a living, knowing the terminology and the framework and the vocabulary of behavioral analysis, and had understood not wrongly that this meant he was being watched by someone who was professionally trained to notice what he preferred to conceal. This is not a comfortable way to grow up. I had understood this abstractly. I had not understood it in the specific way that would have changed how I showed up. He has never said this directly. He does not say most things directly. What he has said, in the specific vocabulary of a person who has been adjacent to a behavioral scientist long enough to learn the terminology without fully absorbing the substance, is that he finds our relationship transactional. I have thought about this word for several years. It is not entirely wrong. It is also not the full picture. What happened in the 43 days between the hospital and the bench outside Carol's office gave me a very clear view of what Jay finds transactional about our relationship and what I find alarming about his. The heart attack came on a Wednesday morning in January. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and the manuscript I had been working on since Margaret passed, a book about behavioral deception and family systems that I had begun writing as a way of doing something with all the hours that grief opened up. I felt the pressure in my chest with the specific quality of something that is not indigestion, and I called 911 with a steadiness that I attribute partly to professional training and partly to the particular calm of someone who has already survived the worst thing and who understands that everything subsequent is negotiable. The paramedics arrived in 6 minutes. I was at the hospital in 11. I was in surgery within the hour. What happened at the hospital in the days that followed was a series of events that began with a clerical error and developed into something considerably more significant. On the 3rd day of my hospitalization, while I was in a medically induced coma following complications from the surgery, a patient in an adjacent room died. The death was correctly documented in that patient's file. Through a sequence of administrative errors involving a shared patient identifier prefix and a records transfer between two departments, a copy of the death notification was filed in my chart under my name as well. A hospital administrator discovered the error 11 days later when I had regained consciousness and was clearly not dead. By that point, the erroneous notification had been in my file for 8 days and had, during those 8 days, been accessed by the system that generates next of kin notifications. Jay received a next of kin notification on the 4th day of my hospitalization, informing him that Kevin Arthur Hart had passed away at 3:47 inches the morning. Lisa received the same notification. She called the hospital immediately. She was told by a nurse who had not seen the erroneous file that I was in the ICU in critical condition and not expected to survive. She got in her car and drove to Harrisburg. Jay called the hospital. He was told the same thing Lisa was told. He did not get in his car. What Jay did instead, in the 43 days between the notification and the morning I walked into Carol Vance's office, is the subject of this story. I know what he did because Lisa told me. She told me in pieces over the weeks of my recovery, not all at once and not easily, the way you tell someone something that you believe they need to know and that you know will hurt them. She told me because she is honest and because she believed I deserved accurate information about what had happened in my absence, and because she understood, as a daughter who has grown up with a behavioral scientist for a father, that information withheld from someone who would eventually find it anyway is simply a postponed conversation with interest added. She was right about all of it. Jay had called Carol Vance's office on the 5th day after the notification. He had identified himself as my son and next of kin and had asked about the status of my estate documentation. Carol had confirmed that a will existed and had described in general terms consistent with her professional obligations that it named both children as beneficiaries. Jay had asked about the timeline for probate. Carol had explained the standard process. Jay had asked whether there were any provisions in the will that were likely to be contested. Carol had said she was not in a position to discuss the specific contents of the will prior to the formal reading. Jay had called again the following week with questions about the house on Chestnut Street. He had asked whether the house was in my name alone or in a trust. He had asked about its estimated value. Carol had said she could not discuss specific asset structures prior to the reading, but had noted, in her internal record, that he had asked about the house specifically and by address. Jay had called 3 more times over the following month. Each call had been professional and courteous and had concerned a specific aspect of the estate that he was trying to understand before the reading. The 3rd call had included a question about whether a charitable remainder trust was part of the estate structure, which told Carol, and subsequently told me, that he had been doing research in the interval between calls. Carol had answered what she could and declined what she could not. She had flagged each call in her notes with the date, duration, and substance of the inquiry. She had shown me the notes during one of my recovery visits to her office, 3 weeks before the reading, when I had explained the situation and asked her to proceed with the reading as scheduled. I had read them twice at her desk and once more at home that evening. Then I had asked her to keep the appointment and to let me sit outside until the reading began. There are several things Jay did not know that are relevant to understanding what happened on the Tuesday afternoon in March. The first was that I was alive. He had been told on the 4th day that I was not expected to survive and had not followed up with the hospital in a way that would have confirmed whether I had. He had assumed the expected outcome had occurred and had proceeded accordingly. When Lisa had told him, approximately 2 weeks after my discharge, that I was alive and recovering at home, his response had been, by Lisa's description, not relief but recalibration. A long silence followed by a series of practical questions about my prognosis and likely recovery timeline. The second thing Jay did not know was that I had updated my will 6 months before the heart attack, Margaret's. Death had made it necessary to reconsider the estate structure. The original will had left everything equally to Jay and Lisa. After Margaret passed, I had thought carefully about what I wanted my estate to reflect and had made several changes. The primary change was the establishment of the Margaret Hart Educational Foundation, a charitable organization endowed with 60% of the estate's liquid assets, dedicated to funding forensic psychology research and graduate scholarships in Margaret's name. She had supported my career with 43 years of patience and sacrifice, and I had wanted to honor that support in a way that would persist. The remaining 40% was divided equally between Jay and Lisa, with one additional provision. The house on Chestnut Street was to go to Lisa, specifically, and not as part of the general estate. Because Lisa had been present consistently, and because Lisa had spent the months after Margaret's death coming to Harrisburg every 6 weeks to sit with me in the house that was too quiet, and because the house meant something to her, that it did not mean to Jay in the same way. Jay did not know about the foundation. He did not know about the house provision. He knew only that the will named both children as beneficiaries and that the estate was substantial. The third thing Jay did not know was that I had been awake for the conversation outside Carol's door. He had said, "Dad is finally gone. We can stop pretending everything was fine." I had been sitting on the bench for 12 minutes by then. I had heard clearly. I had not moved. I walked into the conference room and Jay looked at me and said nothing, for a period of time that I estimated at approximately 8 seconds. Which is a significant duration of silence in a room with 3 other people in it. Lisa had her arms around me. Carol was at the head of the table with the will in front of her. Jay was seated across from where I stood, his hands flat on the table, his face working through the recalibration that I had spent 35 years teaching students to recognize. I sat down next to Lisa. I said, "Jay." He said, "Dad." His voice was careful in the specific way of someone choosing each word with awareness that the wrong word will cost them. I said, "I heard what you said outside." He said, "Dad." I said, "Let me finish. I have been in a hospital for 43 days. I came directly from the hospital to this building because Carol and I agreed that the reading should proceed on schedule regardless of my attendance. I sat outside for 12 minutes. I heard what you said." He said, "I didn't know you were there." I said, "I know. That's precisely why I was listening." Carol said, "Should we proceed with the reading?" I said, "Please." Carol read the will. She read it completely and without editorial comment, which is her professional manner and which I have always appreciated. She read the foundation provision first. I watched Jay's face as she described the 60% allocation to the Margaret Hart Educational Foundation. The recalibration was visible. He was good at managing his expression, but not good enough. She read the house provision. Lisa made a small sound beside me and reached for my hand. She read the 40% split between the 2 children. When she finished, the room was quiet. Jay said, 60% to a foundation." I said, "Yes." He said, "That was decided 6 months ago." I said, "Yes." He said, "Before the heart attack." I said, "Yes." He said, "So all of those calls to Carol about the estate," I said, "were answered with exactly the information Carol was able to provide, which was that both children were named as beneficiaries." That was accurate. Jay looked at the table. He was processing something, and I gave him the time to process it. He said, "You knew I called." I said, "Carol keeps thorough notes. She showed them to me." He said, "How many times did I call?" I said, 5 times over 6 weeks. He said, "Dad." I said, "Jay, I want to say something to you, and I need you to hear it as information rather than accusation. Can you do that?" He looked at me. He nodded once. I said, "You received a notification that I had died. You did not get in your car. You did not come to the hospital. You called my attorney 5 times over the following 6 weeks asking questions about the estate. I understand that grief takes different forms, and that your relationship with me has been complicated in ways that I take some responsibility for. But I want you to understand what I observed and what it means to me." He said, "I thought you were gone." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't see the point of," I said, "of coming." He said nothing. I said, Lisa drove 4 hours and sat in a hospital waiting room for 3 days, not knowing whether I would live. You called a lawyer. I am not telling you this to wound you. I am telling you this because the difference between those two responses tells me something about where we are and what we need to address. Jay said, I'm not Lisa. I said, no, you're not. But you are my son, and I have spent 35 years studying what people reveal about themselves in moments when they believe the consequences have been removed. And what you revealed, Jay, is that your primary concern when you believed I was gone was what I had left behind. I am asking you to sit with that. The room was very quiet. Lisa said nothing. Carol said nothing. Jay said, after a long time, I'm sorry. I said, I know. He said, I don't know why I didn't come. I said, I think you do. I think you've always known something was wrong between us, and I think you've been managing that knowledge by maintaining distance, and I think when the distance became permanent, you defaulted to the practical because the emotional was too much to approach directly. That is not unusual behavior. It is human behavior. But it is behavior that has consequences, and you are sitting in front of one of them now. He said, the foundation. I said, the foundation was about your mother, not about you. He said, the house. I said, the house is about Lisa being present when presence mattered. That is also not about you. He said, what is about me? I said, this conversation, right now. This is the first honest conversation we have had in 20 years, and it is happening because I sat on a bench outside that door for 12 minutes and decided that honesty was the only thing worth doing with whatever time I have left. Jay drove back to Pittsburgh that evening. He called me 3 days later. The call was different from any call we had had in 20 years in the specific way that things are different when the performance has stopped and what remains is just two people without a script. He said, Dad, I want to understand something. I said, ask. He said, when you were in the hospital, the 43 days, were you afraid? I thought about this question carefully because it deserved a careful answer. I said, I was afraid of the pain. I was afraid of the recovery being harder than I could manage alone. I was afraid of dying before I finished the book. A pause. I was not afraid of being forgotten. He said, why not? I said, because Lisa was there, and because the work I did for 35 years and the students I taught and the foundation I established in your mother's name will persist after me in ways that do not depend on whether my children remember me correctly. He said, that sounds very composed for someone who was in the ICU. I said, I was unconscious for the first 11 days. I was very composed. He laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh in a way that was not managed in several years. He said, I want to come to Harrisburg, not for the estate, just to come. I said, yes, come for a weekend. He came the following month. We sat in the kitchen on Chestnut Street, the kitchen where Margaret had made breakfast every morning for 27 years. And we drank coffee and talked about his work and about the book I was writing and about Margaret and about what it had been like for Jay to grow up with a father whose professional focus was the study of human deception. He said, did you know when I was a teenager and I lied to you? Did you always know? I said, almost always. He said, why didn't you say anything? I said, because catching a lie is not the same as addressing the reason for it. I was always more interested in why you felt you needed to lie than in the lie itself. I don't think I communicated that well. He said, no, you didn't. I said, that's fair. He said, I thought you were always evaluating me, like a subject. I said, I was always watching you. That is not the same as evaluating. A father watches his children the way any person watches something they love, carefully, because they want to understand it. He was quiet for a while. He said, I should have come to the hospital. I said, yes. He said, I know why I didn't. I said, I know too. You don't have to say it. He said, I think I should. I let him. He did. It took a long time, and it was not linear, and it covered more than the hospital, covering years of accumulated distance and misread signals and the specific loneliness of being the child of someone whose professional expertise is understanding people and who still managed to miss what his own son needed. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "You're right about most of that." He said, "Most?" I said I wasn't evaluating you, but I understand why it felt that way. He stayed for the weekend. He came back the month after. Carol Vance called me on a Monday morning in April to confirm that the foundation paperwork was complete and that the Margaret Hart Educational Foundation was officially established. The first scholarship would be awarded in the fall to a graduate student in forensic psychology at Temple University, Margaret's alma mater. I told Lisa that evening. She said Margaret would have found the whole thing slightly embarrassing and entirely wonderful, which was accurate. I am 71 years old. I spent 35 years teaching students that the most revealing moments in human behavior are the moments when people believe the consequences have been removed, when the observer is gone, when the stakes appear to have dissolved, when the performance is no longer required. My son Jay believed for 43 days that the consequences had been removed. What he revealed in those 43 days was real, and it was painful, and it was also, in the specific way that true things are useful, more valuable to me than another 20 years of careful managed distance would have been. I am not angry at Jay. I am something more complicated than angry. I am a father who spent 35 years studying other people's behavior and who still managed to miss what was happening in his own household, who maintained a professional detachment in a relationship that required the opposite, who is now sitting in the kitchen on Chestnut Street with a son who drove 4 hours to drink coffee and talk honestly for the first time in 20 years. That is not a failure. It is a beginning. The book is nearly finished. It is dedicated to Margaret, who spent 43 years watching me study other people's honesty while practicing her own without commentary. I think she would have found the dedication fitting. The bench outside Carol's office is still uncomfortable. I know this because I sat on it again last month when I came in to sign the final foundation documents. I sat there for a few minutes before Carol came out, and I thought about the Tuesday in March and what I had heard through the frosted glass and what I had decided to do with what I heard. I thought about the specific 8 seconds of Jay's face when he turned and saw me. And I thought about how much of what followed the conversation, the calls, the weekend visits, the slow and imperfect work of building something more honest between us had depended on me being on that bench and being patient enough to listen. The best move is the one they never saw coming. Tell me in the best comments. Has someone you love ever revealed something about themselves in a moment when they thought the stakes were gone? I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below.